Hello, dear students of the third secondary grade, and welcome to a new episode of our program. It's time for biology, and on this episode, we'll be discussing and explaining the remaining part of Chapter 1, Movement in Living Organisms, with our teacher of biology, Mr. Sharif Farghali, expert of biology at the Ministry of Education. Hello, Mr. Sharif, and welcome to the program.
Hello, yes. Hello,
Mr. Sharif, you've already started Chapter 1, the previous episode, and you discussed support implants and in animals. Could you please sum up this part where we stopped last episode?
Okay. We explained the support implants and support in animals. The support implant is divided into two types of support: physiological support and structural support. The physiological support is due to the presence of water inside the cell vacuole that act as a kind of temporary support. But the structural support is due to the deposition of some substance on the cell wall of the plant. But the support in animals is skeletal, or the skeletal system, or the skeleton in human beings, which is divided into axial and appendicular skeleton. And we explained the three parts of the axial skeleton, which is the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage, and also the appendicular skeleton, which is the shoulder girdle or pectoral girdle and the upper limbs, and the pelvic girdle and the hand or the lower limbs.
Could we have any questions on that part before we carry on with the rest of the chapter?
Yes, we are going to explain some of the questions about the first part of chapter 1, which is the support and movement. After that, we will going to explain the rest, or the second part of chapter 1, which is the movement in the living organisms.
So there is no talk. There is no talk in this chapter about emotional support.
No.
Okay.
Yes. Now we are going to explain some of the questions about the first part of chapter 1. The first question give the scientific term for each of the following: a curved bone attached to the vertebra at its centrum and its transverse process. The question ask about the curved bone, which is the rib. So the rib is a curved bone that attached to the vertebra at the centrum and the transverse process of the vertebra. Second gives scientific term: a girdle consists of two identical halves of the scapula and the clavicle bone. The girdle, which consists of scapula and the clavicle bone, is a shoulder or pectoral girdle. That is the right answer. The next: a joint consists of two rows of 8 carpels. The joint, which consists of 2 rows of 8 carpels. The joint acts as a kind of synovial joint, which is the wrist joint. The wrist joint acts as a limited movement joint. The next question: a girdle consists of 2 halves fused at the pubic symphysis. The 2 pupa are fused at the ventral side at the pubic symphysis. This girdle is a pelvic girdle, so the right answer is the pelvic girdle. A deep depression at the connection between the ilium and the ischium bone. Ilium and the ischium bone are 2 bones of the 3 bones of each half of the pelvic girdle: ilium, ischium, and the pubis. So the depression, or the cavity between ilium and the ischium, is a acetipulum cavity, where the head of the femur fit inside. The next: the largest bone of 7 tarsals that form the ankle. The largest bones of the tarsals, it is the heel bone. The next: physiological support in plants is represented by thickness of plant cell to prevent water loss in plants, turgidity of the plant cells, turgidity of vessels filled with nutrients, the depression of the cellulose on the cell wall. The physiological support is a support due to the presence of water inside the cell vacuole, which leads to the turgidity of the plant cells. The next: the total number of the vertebra in the human vertebral column is that act as a very simple question because the vertebral column consists of 33 vertebrae. The next, the two halves of the pelvic girdles are fused anteriorly at the dots region. The region of the two halves of the pelvic girdle is called the pubic symphysis. The next, the total number of cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae of the vertebral column in man is the total number of cervical, 7, thoracic, 12, lumbar, 5, so the total is 24 vertebrae. The transverse process is present in the skull, vertebra, pelvis, or scapula. The right answer is the vertebra. The next, compare between the vertebra number 20 and the vertebra number 30. Vertebra number 20, its size is the lumbar region at the abdominal region. But the vertebra number 30 is the coccyx region below the sacral. The shape of the vertebra number 20 is the biggest vertebra, but that at the number 30 is a small and diffused. That's the comparison between the vertebra number 2 and the vertebra number 20 and the number 30. The next, compare between palm bones and the foot bones. The palm, the hand, and the foot in the leg. The palm consists of metacarpals followed by 5 digits. Each is made of 3 phalanges except the thumb, which consists of 2 phalanges only. That's the palm. But the foot consists of metatarsals. The metatarsals are 5 also, similar to that of the metacarpals in the palm. The metatarsals followed by 5 toes, each made of 3 phalanges except the big toe, consists of 2 phalanges only. That's a comparison between palm bones and the foot bones. The next question is a match question. Select from the column B what suits for the column A. Column A, the humerus, number 2, femur, number 3, pelvis, number 4, scapula, number 5, lumbar vertebra. So what about the humerus bone? It connected with the number B of the column B, one of the upper limb of bones. But the femur, one of the lower limb bones. The pelvis is a bone of the pelvic girdle. Scapula is a bone of the shoulder bones. The lumbar vertebra, 5 in number. But the last part was no answer, 12 in number. That is the number of the thoracic vertebra, which is not located at the column A. Also match the match question that select from the column B what suits for the column A. Shoulder girdle, thoracic cage, the rib, the pelvic girdle. At the column B, protect the brain. Of course, that is the skull, but that's not located in the column A. Where the humerus head fit. The humerus fit inside the shoulder girdle or in the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The bone which protects the heart and the lungs, that is the thoracic cage. Fix with the centrum of the vertebra from the back. It is the thoracic vertebra, it is the ribs which connected with the thoracic vertebra at the centrum and the transverse process, so that's number 3. Where the head of the femur fits, that is the acetipulum cavity or the pelvic girdle. So that is the right answer. The shoulder girdle where the humerus head fit. Thoracic cage protects the heart and the lungs. The rib fixed with the centrum of the vertebra from the back. The pelvic girdle where the head of the femur fits. So that's the question of part 1, which is the support in living organisms. But at the movement in living organisms, that's the second part of chapter 1. What about the types of movement in living organisms? The types of movement is the 3 types of movement. Continuous movement, as that of the cytoplasm inside the living cells to keep it alive. local movement or positional movement at the peristalsis in the alimentary canal or the leaves of the insectivorous plants, the movement from place to another. The animals move from place to another searching for food, protection, and carry out the sexual reproduction. So in general, the types of movement in living organisms is the three types: the continuous movement, local or positional movement, and the movement from place to another one. That's the main three types of the movement. But what about the local movement as a type of the movement? The local movement, which is called the positional movement, at the movement of the peristalsis that appear in this movement of the bolus inside the esophagus or inside the alimentary canal, that takes place by series of contraction and relaxation, which is called the peristalsis, and also the movement of the leaves of insectivorous plants or the petals of the flowers, and also the stomatophores of the guard cells of the stomatophores that act as a kind of oppositional movement. What about the movement from place to another one? The movement from place to another one as that in the animals, where the animals move for search or protection or hide from the enemies or carry out the sexual reproduction. This kind of movement can help the animal to move from place to another one. So that's the types of movement in the living organisms. Compare between the continuous movement and the positional movement. The continuous movement, the cytoplasm inside any living cell move to keep the cell alive. The cytoplasm inside any living cell move to keep the cytoplasm. That's the continuous movement of the cytoplasm. But the positional movement, as a movement of the peristalsis in the alimentary canal, the movement of the leaves of the insectivorous plants, or the movement of any part of the body as the same position, that's called the positional movement. What about the types of movement in plants? The movement in all the living organisms divided into the continuous movement, the local movement, and the movement from place to another. But that's the four types of movement in plants. The first is the touch movement. The second is the sleep movement. The third is the haptotropism, which is called the pulling movement. And the fourth one is the cytoplasmic streaming as a kind of movement in plants. So what about the first kind of the movement in plant? That's the touch movement. If we touch the leaves of the mimosa plant, we will observe that the leaves of the mimosa plant drops as it has wilted, followed by the dropping of the petioles or the racks of the mimosa plant if it is touched.
So can we say that plants move above the soil, not in the soil?
No, that's not right, because some of the plant parts move above the soil particles. But the roots, which act as the very important part of the plant inside the soil,
The roots move?
the roots move around the soil particles to fix the plant to the soil, and causing a pulling movement downward to keep the plant at a suitable distance of the soil.
But not far away.
Yes, of course. But
Slight movement, should we say?
yes, that's slight movement. But the first type of the movement, which is called the touch movement, the video or this video can explain the touch movement in mimosa plant. If you touch the leaves of the mimosa plant, we can observe that the leaves of the mimosa plant drop as if it has wilted. شوف بنبص على الليف كده بتقرب من بعضها، بتبدأ تفضل تقرب من بعضها بمجرد ما بلبسها، علشان كده بنسمي الحركة دي touch movement in mimosa plant. لكن غير التاتش موفمنت عندنا كمان حاجة اسمها sleeping movement also in the mimosa plant or in some of the leguminous plants. If the leaves of the mimosa plant or leguminous plant exposed to darkness at this image, that explains that the upper surface of the leaf is folded during the darkness that takes place in the mimosa plant and also in the leguminous plant. but during the light, the leaves of the mimosa plant take its position to absorb the light energy to carry out photosynthesis. That's act as a kind of movement. It takes place during the darkness, so that's called the sleep movement. So the four types of movement in plants is a touch movement, sleep movement. The third is a pulling movement, which is called thigmotropism or haptotropism or stereotropism. That's the same concepts of the pulling movement in pea plant. In pea plant, the tendril twine around the support due to the accumulation of the auxin at the side away from the support. It grows faster than the side that near the support to so that allows the support, the tendril twin or move around the support. If you suppose that my hand is a tendril and the tendril approaches the support, the auxin move from this side that approaches the support to the side that away to the support. The side away from the support containing a high concentration of auxin, which accelerates the growth of the cells that away from the support. So that allows the tendril to twin around the support. So the length of the tendril decrease, that pulls the plant to become beside the support, to grow vertically beside the support. هنشوف فيديو دلوقتي معانا عشان يقول لنا ازاي التندرل ده بيتحرك وازاي بيدور على السبورت بتاعه. الجزء ده من البلانت ستيم ده اسمه تندرل. التندرل ده هيبدأ يعمل move around the support اهو searching in air for a support until the tendril reach the presence of any support. If the tendril finds the support, the tendril move around the support, so the length of the tendril decrease. If the length of the tendril decrease, that pulls the plant become the support to grow vertically, because this plant has no structural support at the first time, but after that the plant can't form structural support. But if the tendril is not find a support, the tendril will die and the plant will form another tendril. So that is the third kind of movement in plant. But the fourth kind, or the third kind, or the second kind of the pulling movement, which acts as a haptotropism, is a pulling movement by roots, which is called the pulling movement. The roots move around the soil particles and contact, so they pull the plant downwards to keep the plant at a suitable distance in the soil to overcome the action of the wind. So these parts of roots wander around the soil particles, its length decrease, so that pulls the plant downward to keep the plant at a suitable distance to overcome the action of the wind.
So what is the best answer to this question?
Yes.
Give reasons for the pea tendrils go around the support.
That because of the presence of the auxin. The auxin, if the tendril approaches the support, the auxin move at the side away from the support to the side which containing a high concentration of auxin grow faster than that facing the support. Therefore, the tendril move around the support or twisted around the support. Therefore, the length of the tendril decrease, that to pull the plant to grow vertically beside the support. So that takes place due to the action of auxin in general.
Okay.
Yes. So the third kind, which is called the haptotropism, is the pulling movement in pea plant by the tendril and the pulling movement in bulbs by the pulling roots. So what is the difference between pulling movement in pea plant and the pulling movement in bulbs or corms? The pulling movement in pea plant need a support, but the pulling movement in bulbs doesn't need the presence of support. The movement of the pulling movement in pea plant move by the tendril, but in the bulbs move by the pulling roots. The tendril move in air, but the roots move around the soil particles. The movement direction is upwards, but the direction of movement by the roots is downwards. The importance of the tendril, it supports the stem to grow vertically until the plant stem approach the support and grow vertically. But the importance of the polling roots, keep the stem at the suitable distance to protect the plant against the action of the wind. That's the comparison between polling movement in pea plant or by tendril and the polling movement in bulbs by the polling roots. Give one function for each of the following. The tendril. The function of the tendril is support the stem to grow vertically until the plant stem approach the support and grow vertically. So that is the function of the tendril. The movement of the tendril takes place by the action of auxin or the accumulation of auxin as a side away from the support. The next slide. The fourth type of the movement in plant is the cytoplasmic streaming. The cytoplasm of the living organism rotates continuously for the transportation inside the cell. Transportation means transport the food to all the organelles inside the cell. The cytoplasm carry chloroplast and rotates in one direction in elodia cells. نبص على فيديو كده يقول لنا ازاي بيتحرك السيتوبلازم او ازاي نشوف cytoplasmic streaming inside the elodia plant. شايفين كده السيتوبلازم ده transparent لكن احنا بنشوف الكلوروبلاست that move or rotate inside the cell which carried by the cytoplasm. So cytoplasm move inside the cell carrying the chloroplast. That's called the cytoplasmic streaming. We make this experiment by the elodia plant because the elodia plant is an aquatic plant. The cells can survive after the carrying out transverse section in water, and explain or to explain the cytoplasmic streaming which act as a kind of continuous movement inside the plant. So the four kinds of the movement in plant is the touch movement, sleeping movement, haptotropism, and cytoplasmic streaming. That's the four types of movement in plant. What about the movement in animals or in man? The movement in man depends on the presence of three systems. The first system is a skeletal system that to support the limbs. The second is a muscular system which has the ability to contract and relax to causing motion. The third system is a nervous system. Give the orders or the motor impulses to control the muscle movement and open during the lightness. So that is the nervous system which send orders to the muscles to move. What about the muscular system which act as the very important system responsible for the movement in the animals? The muscular system is a group of the body muscles by which affected parts of the body can move, or different or many parts of the body can move. The muscular system consists of the muscles. The muscles consists of the muscular tissue, have the ability to contract and relax causing motion, and the muscle usually known as flesh. The number of muscles in man is about 620 muscles. That's the muscular system, which is the only system made of tissue has the ability to contract and relax causing motion. But what about the functions of the muscles? The function of the muscles is the movement and the transportation from one place to another one. Also, the movement of the blood inside the body to carry food and wastes, hormones, and the other compounds to the whole body organs. And also, the maintain body position. The maintain body position takes place by the presence of the muscles at all the sides of the body. So that's the function of the muscles in the human beings. What about the structure of the muscle? The muscle consists of large number of muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber containing a large number of nuclei. Each muscle fiber consists of cytoplasm called sarcoplasm and cell membrane which is called the sarcolemma. So the membrane of this muscle fiber is called the sarcolemma, but the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber is the sarcoplasm. a group of muscle fiber are connected together to form the muscle bundle. But each muscle fiber consists of from 1,000 to 2,000 myofibrils that act at the very small fibrous, which is called the myofibrils, that are arranged longitudinally and parallel to the longitudinal axis of the muscle. So that's a group of the myofibril from 1,000 to 2,000 myofibrils that parallel to each other and parallel to the principal axis. That's in general the muscle fiber. But what about the muscle bundle? The muscle bundle is a group of muscle fibers that collected together and surrounded by the membrane, which is called perimysium. Each muscle fiber consists of the myofibrils from 1,000 to 2,000, and also the cytoplasm is called sarcoplasm, but the membrane is called the sarcolemma. هنشوف مع بعضنا دلوقتي ازاي المسل تعمل contraction. لما بص كده دي قدامنا دي muscle. Yes. دي muscle containing or consists of a group of muscle bundles. اللي قدامنا دي muscle، وكل جروب من دول، كل حزمة من دول بنسميها muscle bundle. المسل bundle ده a group of muscle fibers each surrounded by, or the muscle bundle surrounded by the perimysium membrane. When the motor impulses reach the muscle plate, the muscle can contract. So the contraction of the muscle takes place by the presence of the certain neurochemical transmitter, which is called the acetylcholine. When the acetylcholine reaches the muscle plate, that it changes the state of the polarization into depolarization by changing the charge of the membrane, or the selective permeability of the membrane, to allow the membrane to allow the sodium ions to move from outside to inside, to change the charge of the outer membrane from positive to negative and the inner membrane from negative to positive. That's called the depolarization. The depolarization leads to the muscle contraction. So that is the muscle bundle. What about the structure of the myofibril? The myofibril consists of a group of alternation of light bands and dark bands. The light bands and the dark bands, the light bands is called the I band. That consists of thin filaments called actin bisected by Z line. But the dark bands made of thick filaments called myosin that bisected by semi-lighted area, which is called the H zone. The distance between two successive Z lines are called the sarcomere. Sarcomere is the unit of the myofibril at the part of the cell which consists of, or the muscle fiber which consists of from 1,000 to 2,000 myofibrils. The mechanism of the contraction of the muscle fiber, or how the muscle, the myofibril contract to causing the contraction of the muscle, that takes place due to the presence of the transverse links that extended from the actin, from the myosin to the two sides of the actin filaments, to pull the actin from both sides toward each other by these transverse links that formed at the presence of the calcium ions and the ATP molecules. So this is the part of the theory which is called Huxley theory. Huxley theory explains the structure, the contraction of the muscle by comparing between two images of the myofibrils, one of them during a contraction and the other during the relaxation. Huxley concludes that the protein filaments slide over each other due to the presence of the transverse links that extended from the myosin filaments and attach to the actin filaments. The transverse links are formed at the presence of the calcium ions and the ATP molecules. The transverse links act as hooks that pull the actin filaments from both sides toward each other, leading to the muscle contraction. That is the appearance of the myofibril under the electronic microscope. The actin filaments slide toward each other or toward the myosin at both sides, so the area which is called the simulated area decrease, and the myofibril decrease that leads to the muscle contraction. And the opposite takes place during the relaxation, where separation of the transverse links from the actin filaments to allow the actin to move away from the transverse links that need the presence of energy in the form of ATP. So the contraction of the muscle needs the presence of ATP that to form the transverse links, and also the separation of the transverse links from the actin that need the presence of energy. That's the sliding theory which explains the contraction of the myofibril. What about the motor unit? It is the unit function of the skeletal muscle, because the muscle contraction is the sum of all motor units forming the muscle. Each motor unit consists of a group of muscle fiber and the nerve fiber supplying them. When the nerve fiber enter the muscle, it divides into large number of branches which supply a group of muscle fibers that's divided, or the branches from 5 to 100 branches that reach the muscle fiber. So contraction takes place of all parts of the muscle. That's called the action of the contraction of the motor unit. What about the neuromuscular junction? Neuromuscular junction is a point of connection between the terminal branch of the nerve fiber or the motor nerve and the motor in the plate of the muscle fiber. That's the muscle fiber. That's the terminal arborization of the motor nerve. That's the connection between the motor nerve and the muscle plate is called synapses or neuromuscular junction. This question asks about the presence of the cholinesterase enzyme at the neuromuscular junction. What about the function of the what's the function of the cholinesterase enzyme? The cholinesterase enzyme, it is the enzyme responsible for destroying the acetylcholine after performing its function. Because when the acetylcholine reaches the muscle plate, that it changes the permeability of the membrane to allow the membrane to move, or to help the sodium ions to move from outside to inside. That it changes the membrane from the state of polarization to depolarization. That is acetylcholine, which reaches the receptors that allow the gates to open to allow the sodium ions to move from outside to inside. That it changes the state of polarization into depolarization. These parts is called or represent the cholinesterase enzyme. The cholinesterase enzyme destroys the acetylcholine into choline and acetate. That to allow the membrane to regain its polarization in the process which is called, or in the state which is called, the repolarization process. So the muscle can relax. So the only stimulus of the muscle is the neurochemical transmitter which is called the acetylcholine. When the acetylcholine reaches the muscle plate, that changes the selective permeability of the membrane. That means it allows the membrane to allow the sodium ions to move from the outside to inside. That it changes the state of the polarization of the muscle plate to depolarization. The depolarization leads to the muscle contraction. But if the acetylcholine is still on the muscle plate, that means the muscle is still contract. To allow the muscle to relax, we need to destroy the acetylcholine, which is the only stimulus of the muscle plate. So the cholinesterase enzyme breaks down the acetylcholine after performing its function into choline and acetate. So that allows the muscle to regain its state, which is called the repolarization, and the muscle can relax. So the neurochemical transmitter is the stimulus of the muscle fiber, but the substance or the enzyme which is called the cholinesterase enzyme responsible for destroying the acetylcholine after performing its function. Give reason for destruction of the accumulated lactic acid in the muscle after short time from its formation. The destruction of the accumulated lactic acid in the muscle after short time from its formation. We remember that the formation of lactic acid that takes place due to the anaerobic respiration, which takes place inside the cell. That the muscle that's the gastrocnemius muscles. The gastrocnemius muscles end with a tendon which is called the Achilles tendon. That the video explained the contraction of this muscle, but the movement of the muscle with the absence of sufficient amount of oxygen allow the muscle to respire anaerobically at the presence of the glucose, but the absence of the oxygen or shortage of oxygen. Besides the aerobic respiration, the muscle respire anaerobically, that leads to the presence or the accumulation of lactic acid inside the muscle. The accumulation of lactic acid leads to the muscle fatigue. So, after a sufficient amount, the amount of oxygen can reach the muscle. So, that leads to the oxidation of lactic acid into pyruvic acid that oxidize it into acetyl groups that get inside the Krebs cycle to produce great amount of energy. So, the destruction of the accumulated lactic acid in the muscle after short time from its formation due to the presence of sufficient amount of oxygen, which oxidize the lactic acid into certain compound which is called pyruvic acid to produce great amount of energy, and also leads to overcome the muscle fatigue. But remember that the muscle fatigue takes place due to the shortage of oxygen. Accordingly, the muscle convert glycogen into glucose, which oxidize anaerobically, means at the absence of oxygen, to produce rapid amount of ATP, 2 molecules of ATP only, to allow the muscle to contract, causing the accumulation of lactic acid. This lactic acid leads to the muscle fatigue, so we need the presence of oxygen and the presence of ATP to allow the lactic acid to oxidize, and also allow the transverse links to separate from the actin filaments that need the presence of sufficient amount of ATP. So the muscle fatigue takes place due to the accumulation of lactic acid during the shortage of oxygen, and also during the shortage of ATP molecules, which is the energy currency of the cell. Give reason, the sliding theory of the muscle contraction is the most acceptable to explain the muscle contraction. The sliding theory of Huxley acts as the most acceptable theory of the muscle contraction because it depends on the microscopic structure of the muscle fiber and the presence of the myofibrils, which consists of thin actin filaments and the thick myosin filaments. So the transverse link that extended from the myosin toward the actin filaments allow the actin to move toward each other and also toward the myosins that decrease the length of the myofibril and leads to the muscle contraction. That's the answer of the give reason. The sliding theory is the most acceptable theory to explain the muscle contraction. Give reasons, the muscle fiber need energy during the muscle contraction. The muscle fiber need energy during the muscle contraction because the muscle contraction is due to pulling of actin filaments from both sides toward each other by the transverse link that extended from the myosin. And also the transverse links need the presence of sufficient amount of ATP to causing the separation between the transverse links and the actin filaments to allow the muscle to relax. The next question. Shivering of the body during winter. يعني ليه الجسم بيترعش لما نبقى في الشتاء او نبقى في استوديو نمبر 12 the same يعني. فاحنا في الحالة دي shivering the body during the winter that to generate sufficient amount of heat or of energy to keep our body temperature to constant. So the shivering that produce sufficient amount of energy that can keep the body temperature, so that act as a mechanism of the body to overcome the low temperature around the body or in the environment around the body.
But sometimes people may, may feel sick and their bodies shiver even in high temperature.
Yes, that means the body temperature is higher than the environmental temperature. So the amount of energy that lost from the body greater than the normal amount of energy that lost during the any time. So when the normal person with the temperature 37 Celsius, the body lose amount of energy but can produce sufficient amount of energy equal that lost during around the environment. But when during the abnormalities, when the temperature of the body become greater than 37 as 39 or 40, that means the body temperature higher than that of the outer environment. So that act as a abnormal case or act as a disease. The shivering act as a mechanism of the nervous system to keep the body temperature against the losing of great amount of energy during this.
Yeah, some people may also shiver out of fear when they are so afraid.
That takes place due to the action of certain hormone which is called the adrenaline hormone. The adrenaline hormone during the fighting or frighting or the critical situation, the hormone, or which is called the adrenal hormone, move the blood from the skin and from the digestive system to direct the blood to a certain centers of the brain and to the muscles. That means the skin lose great amount of the blood which is responsible for the body temperature. Therefore, the man can shivering during the critical situation because the skin lose great amount of the blood due to the action of the adrenaline hormone which helps the body to facing the critical situation.
Okay.
Yes. What about the next question? What's meant by Achilles tendon? Achilles tendon. It is a strong connective tissue that connect the gastrocnemius muscle with the heel bone. At this in the image, that is the gastrocnemius muscle and that is the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon act as a kind of a strong connective tissue that connect the muscle with the bones. So that is the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon can suffer from tearing, and that leads to the presence of certain symptoms. The symptoms is unable to walk or the inability to walk and the heavy movement and also acute pain that if tearing partially takes place in the Achilles tendon. The treatment takes place by the anti-inflammatory, the analgesic, and also by the medical splint that can help in the treatment of the tearing of the Achilles tendon. What about the next question? What about the types, or what are the types of the joints? There are three types of joints: the fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and the synovial joints. The joints is a part between two bones. So what about the first type of the joints, which is called the fibrous joints? They are immovable joints. It can't move, but takes place between two bones which containing the fibrous tissue. By the growing older, the fibrous tissue change into bony tissue. These joints can't move and located at the part of the skull or the cranium part of the skull through its serrated tips. So this part of the skull containing the fibrous tissue, the fibrous tissue change into bony tissue. So this type of joints is not act as a movable joint, but that's act as a immovable joint. But the second kind of the joints is the cartilaginous joints. The cartilage between two bones as that of the two vertebrae that act as a very limited movement joints. Very limited movement joints. So it connects between the ends of some adjacent bone like the cartilage between the vertebra of the vertebral column that allow each of the vertebra to move in a very limited movement. Therefore, this kind of movement is called the very limited movement joints. But the fibrous joints is not act as a movable joints, so they are called immovable joints. But the third kind of the joints is called the synovial joints. These synovial joints, they represent most of the body joints, and the bones which connect the joints are covered with the thin layer of transparent cartilaginous substance, and the bones are smooth, which allows the movement of the bone easily with the less friction. So that's act as a bone. That's the lower part of the femur, and that's the upper part of the shank. So each of the two bones is covered with a thin layer of transparent cartilaginous substance and containing a fluid which is called synovial fluid, which is secreted from the synovial membrane. The fluid protects the friction between the bones and facilitate its movement. Also, this kind of these joints can tolerate the pressure. From the examples of the synovial fluid is the elbow joint and the knee joints, which considered as a limited movement joints because it allows a movement in one bone in one direction, or the movement of one bone in one direction. But the shoulder and the thigh or hip joint act as a wide movement joints because that allows a bone to move in many directions. So the shoulder joint and also the hip joint. The shoulder joint is the joint that formed between the upper part or the head of the humerus with the cavity which is called the glenoid cavity in the scapula. Each of the upper part or the head of the humerus and also the cavity of the glenoid cavity lined internally with a thin layer of the transparent or cartilaginous substance that facilitates the movement of the joint in many directions. And also the presence of the synovial fluid facilitates the movement of the shoulder joint and also the hip joint in many directions. So they are called the wide movement joints. Therefore, the types of joints according the site or according the structure or according the physiology are divided into three types. The first is a fibrous joint. The second is the cartilaginous joint. The third is the synovial fluid. But also we can divide or classify the joints according to the kind of movement into four types. The first is called the unmovable joint as that of the fibrous joints. The second is a very limited movement joint as that of the vertebra or the cartilaginous joint between the vertebra. And the third kind is a limited movement joint as that of the elbow that allow the bone to move in one direction only. But the fourth kind of movement of joints is a wide movement joint, that's the joint that move in many directions as that of the shoulder and the hip joint. So we can classify the joints into three types, and also we can classify the joints according to the movement into four types. Write short account or short notes in each of the following. The cartilage. The cartilages. They are the type of connective tissue made of cartilaginous cells and located usually at the tip of the bones, especially at the joints and between the vertebra of the vertebral column to protect the bones against the corrosion or the erosion due to its continuous friction. The cartilage or the cartilage form some of the body parts as that of the ear, nose, bronchi of the lungs.
They get eroded sometimes in old age.
Yes, that due to the absence of the calcium ions, due to the absence of sufficient amount of hormones, and also due to the decreasing in the whole body activities that may lead to causing erosion or disintegration of certain parts of the joints. But that can be treated by...
Is it due to lots of, let us say, strain, lots of physical activity?
I think that's act as physiological reasons, as the absence of calcium ions, absence of phosphorus, absence of certain hormones that are responsible for the regulation of the phosphorus and the calcium ions inside the body. Also due to the absence of the sports and the activities. The activities
But
can
it's
keep the
not,
body healthy.
Yeah, it's not hereditary.
Yes, may containing hereditary factors that affect this part of the body or the other one. But the diseases may cause due to the presence of certain genes and that act as hereditary, or also the environmental conditions inside the body that can help the gene to act. So may the presence of gene and also the presence of the factors which help the gene to act to causing the disease.
Okay.
What about the ligaments? The ligaments are separated bundles of the fibrous connective tissue. Its tips are fixed on the two bones of the joints and work to link the bones with each other at the joints of that determine the movement of the joints in the front direction. The fibers of the ligaments are characterized by the presence of strong durability, and also it has a degree of elasticity to allow the joint to tolerate the pressure and the other external conditions, so that can keep the joint.
Could you tell us briefly how different ligaments are from tendons?
Of course, the tendon connect the muscle with bones, but the ligaments connect the bones with each other.
Yeah.
If two bones that form the joints, they connect together by the ligament. But the muscle ends with tendons that connect with the muscle.
All right. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this episode. Mr. Sharif Farghali, I'd like to thank you very much for this explanation of the lesson, for being with us always, and making everything easy for the student. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So that brings us to the end of this episode, dear students of the third secondary grade. We've discussed and explained the remaining part of chapter 1 of unit 1, movement in living organisms. Inshallah, we'll be carrying on with the rest of this part on our next episode. And do join our Facebook group, Madrasa ala Hawa Thanawi. This is our official group, and until we meet you again, wish you all the best. Goodbye.